Here's my game of the day from round 3 of the Sharjah Masters, and I'm looking at the board 1 encounter between Wang Hao and SP Sethuraman. Wang Hao was, about 3 or 4 years ago, right at the top of Chinese chess. It's rating well over 2700, but he's had a bit of a dip in form over the last few years, and well, you can see his rating is now under 2700. He's playing SP Sethuraman, who is one of the huge Indian contingent here in Sharjah, and young Indian grandmaster, very promising indeed. So let's see how they got on. Wang Hao with the white pieces, and he's playing e4, and it's a mainline Spanish. It's great to see the mainline Spanish. Somehow the Berlin has dipped in popularity at the moment, and well, I really like these classical Spanish positions. I've always played them with white. I've never ever played them with black, but I love playing them with white. So black is threatening to play the marshal. So if white were to play c3 here, then after d5 we have a marshal. But instead of playing c3, Wang Hao plays a4, one of the many anti-marshal systems. You can play d3, a3, h3, all these moves have been played, but a4 is, well, actually quite an old move, you could say. So bishop b7. Of course, b4 is possible there as well, but bishop b7 is absolutely fine. And white, considering the potential of the bishop on b7, plays d3 to solidly protect e4. And then white is going to try to prove with this move d3 that this bishop is somewhat misplaced now on b7. You often find later on in these closed anti-marshal positions that this bishop actually ducks back via c8 to e6 to counter the famous Spanish bishop on b3. But okay, that's of course when the position becomes closed again. So d6 is the most popular move here, but instead of that, Sethuraman wants to try and blast open the position and try to prove that this bishop on b7 has a future. E takes d5, and the Indian player recaptured without thought with knight takes d5. And if white now takes on e5, so it's another kind of martial gambit, then the knight comes to d4. Well, we've seen this idea a lot recently. You might recall the game in the World Championship match with this idea. So black is now very, very active, hitting this bishop. So instead of that, Wang Hao played knight d2, just bringing out a piece before deciding what to do in the centre. And this position has been reached a few times before, and, well, for example, a game between Hracek and Plachetka in Slovakia 2006 went knight f4. But that's really what white is looking for. After knight e4, okay, the knight is very, very active, the bishop is looking good. Black ducked the king in the corner, but after taking here and exchanging on b5 and a8, then d4, it's clear that white has central control here. White dominates the centre and stands very well. Let's go back to the game. So knight d2 just played. Sethuraman played f6. As you can see, on the clock time gives 0 seconds. He played this instantly, apparently. And, well, obviously to protect the pawn on e5. And this move is the first choice for computers. So clearly Sethuraman is still in his opening preparation. But f6 is a double-edged move. This is actually, though it might be the computer's first choice, to humanize. That's really what white wants to see, because now black is weak on this diagonal, and after f6 also this diagonal becomes weaker, and this is absolutely typical position for this line in the Spanish, and white now tries to break open the center to try to exploit that, very often with d4, as we'll see. So Wang Hao exchanges on b5 and then exchanges on a8. Now the point of this is to drag the bishop into the corner. Obviously queen takes is impossible because the knight hangs, so the bishop has to go in the corner. That means that very often, well, this defensive move, bishop c8, which in some cases could be useful, is ruled out with the bishop in the corner. And now Wang Hao starts to break open the center. Clearly, if the knight moves, then c takes b5 is check. That's rather important. So black has to take, and white captures, so the knight has been brought to a nice square. And now black hurries to get the king off this diagonal. Obviously a good move. And now again, absolutely typical, white breaks open the middle with d4. Now if black were to just trade on d4 like this, then white is a little bit better here. You can see if that pawn were on f7 and black could play something like bishop f6, black would have no difficulties. But that pawn at f6 is really ugly. It weakens the e6 square, weakens the e-file, weakens this diagonal. Now, maybe with accuracy, black could hold this position. There are a few pawns on the board. Nevertheless, that's uncomfortable for black. There's no doubt about it. Instead, Sethuraman thought for over 20 minutes in this position, and quite correctly played his bishop to b4. So he doesn't want to suffer in some slightly worse position. But the reason he thought for 20 minutes was because this is a very double-edged move. I think it's absolutely correct. But he was obviously calculating the consequences of rook e4, which is what Wang Hao played, to switch the rook to the king side, and then suddenly black's king comes under fire, and we're going to see what happens. Don't forget those weak diagonals after that pawn move f6, and this is absolutely critical. Incidentally, if instead of rook e4 white had played bishop d2, then in fact black can safely take this pawn. So rook e4, really double-edged move for both sides. F5 is a critical move. According to my computer, the best move. The rook would have to swing over, and then black closes the position with e4. But, well, I can understand why Sethuraman had qualms about playing this, because after this, well, we reach a really complicated position where it's not really possible to win this knight. Well, obviously there's a pin at the moment, but avoiding the pin is tricky because you would step into another pin. It's a really hard position to assess at the board. You know, white might want to play e6 and knight f7 at some moment. Maybe the queen can join the struggle. Maybe the rook steps back and then queen h5. It's a really difficult position to assess. According to my computer, black should be okay there, but very, very double-edged. Instead, Sethuraman played knight de7, which I think is certainly a more human move, because it's not giving away any squares. You know, f5 gives away e5 and g5. And of course it's a very reasonable move, and of course there's a bit of pressure here and on d4. Rook h4 played. Rook g4 might be better, and the idea is simply to the rook steps out of the way and d4 is still protected. But anyway, let's look at the game. Rook h4. It's the most obvious move. hammering on h7, and now there are possibilities to sacrifice because the bishop will control the g8 square, and you know, sometimes some kind of snapmate is on the cards, but black can defend. Knight f5, hitting the rook ducks back, and now black took the pawn on d4 quite correctly. And here queen g4, queen h5 also possible. But queen g4 is a very interesting move. Wang Hao played this after 16 minutes thought. The most obvious move is queen h5, threatening checkmate, and the knight. But then the knight comes back. Now it's a very awkward defense, but a very good defense. I suspect this is what both players were analysing for a long time. At first glance, it looks as though white is doing extremely well. He's won the pawn back, threatening checkmate. But now black counterattacks. Queen e7. Threatening a mate, defending against a mate. That bishop, out of the blue, suddenly is looking at g2. And, well, for example, after knight d2, that's to bring the knight back to f1. Suddenly, in this endgame, now there's a threat of mate here, so white has to allow the trade of queens. Now black is better. That's a big pass pawn. That's a really active rook. And white's rook, which was looking very dangerous on the king side, actually is now offside and preventing white playing h3, giving the king some room. So that would really rebound on white. That queen h5 is the obvious move, but not a very good move. Instead, Wang Hao played queen g4. And now black blundered. Queen d5 was correct. Still a very tricky position, but the potential threat to g2 is rather unpleasant. If f3, then d3 opens up this diagonal, and if, let's say, bishop b d2, then, well, black is a pawn up here, and you know, it's hard to see how white is going to somehow get his attack going. There's also this move, knight e3, and now this starts to get very tricky again. So you can see the queen is under fire. Knight takes. Now white can win a queen, but black gets lots of pieces, and well, queen against rook and two minor pieces should be better for black, but still a bit tricky. So queen d5 was the move. Instead, Sethuraman played knight h6. Now he'd simply overlooked a tactic here. Let's see what happened. Wang Hao took. Rook g3 threatens a mate. And after rook g8, knight d6 was game over. A really nice finish. So threatening two mates, one with knight f7, another with queen g8, and if rook g4, rook takes queen, knight check, rook check, and white has an overwhelming material advantage and wins the game. So knight d6 ended the game. Very difficult position to analyse at the board. There are so many tactics, and yeah, very, very hard to analyse indeed. And Sethuraman, I'm afraid, just overlooked one, and that was game over. But very typical for this line that black is weak on these diagonals. So even objectively, if it might be okay for black, in practice, very, very hard to play. So that leaves Wang Hao on 3 out of 3, and it'll be interesting to see how he gets on in the tournament. He's obviously a class player, and I think he'll be there when it comes to the finish.